Phil Muscatello and Finpods are authorised reps of Money Sherpa. The information in this podcast is general in nature and doesn't take into account your personal situation.
G'day and welcome back to Shares for Beginners. I'm Phil Muscatello. What has age-related macular degeneration got to do with the stock market? And how did people invest saving people's eyesight? Joining me today to talk ophthalmology, Big Pharma, and what it takes to bring revolutionary treatments to market is Ian Keldoulis. Hello, Ian.
Hello, Phil. It's wonderful to chat with you.
Ian Keldoulis is the co-author of Unblinded, the startup that launched a revolution in saving sight. Co-written with Dr. David Geyer, the book chronicles the founding of Eyetech Pharmaceuticals and others in 2000 by Dr. Geyer, Tony Adamas and Samir Patel, and their groundbreaking development of Macugen from securing early-stage funding and managing high-risk trials to forging big pharma partnerships and capitalising on market exits. So Ian, tell us, what's your story so far that led you up to co-authoring this book?
Well, it's a very interesting book for me because my father was an ophthalmologist. Indeed, he was president of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Ophthalmology way back when. And he actually retired in 1999 at the age of 70. And this book really gets going pretty much in the year 2000. So for me, it was sort of like, well, what happens next? You know, what happened next in ophthalmology? So that's sort of my interest in it. And obviously, it was fascinating meeting Dr. Geyer and his crew and learning a lot about what happened next and also how this world actually works, which was also new to me. I've written a lot about different things in finance for many, many large companies because I live in New York and that's kind of been my ticket to stay here. But I hadn't really covered this area of venture capital and how it crosses over into the biotech world and all that kind of stuff, leading all the way through to the stock market through IPOs and other things. So it's been very fascinating for me to see both the medical side of things, the science side of things, and the financial side of things in this story, which are all intricately woven together.
I really enjoyed the idea that you discovered that eye doctors were outliers in the medical profession. Eyeballs are for oddballs. Was your dad like that as well? And was this part of what you discovered writing the book?
Yes. Well, when you grow up with your father who is an eye doctor and you meet lots and lots of their colleagues, you tend to think this is what a doctor is. But no, what I discovered when I was writing this book is that actually they are very much outliers in the medical profession. What was key, at least when these doctors were going through their medical schools, and I imagine it's somewhat similar today, there was virtually no teaching around ophthalmology during their main medical course. In fact, one of the doctors told me the only question was, in his final exams, having done all of his training in medicine, was, how do you spell it? So what happens then, of course, is if you are interested in eyes, then you go off and you study that completely separately when you do your fellowship and your residencies and all of those kinds of things. But so they are definitely oddballs.
Only 2 weeks as part of the whole medical course.
Yeah, when you think about how important your eyes are, it's kind of amazing that it gets so little attention. At least in those days, it might have changed a little bit recently, but certainly up to that point, it was definitely a field that was largely unacknowledged during your main medical training.
So tell us about the star of the book, David Geyer. And I'll just throw you a quote that I loved, where he's quoted as saying, "We were a bunch of doctors that knew nothing about business or how to run a company." And I mean, for someone like who was an academic to suddenly become one of the greatest startup founders of all time, perhaps. I don't want to over-egg the pudding here, but it's pretty amazing what he's achieved. Tell us about David and what you've discovered.
Yeah, David's a fascinating person. He's a lovely guy, and I have to say it's amazing the impact that he has had throughout the world, and that's one of the reasons why this book is very important, is it's largely unacknowledged up to this point. David is, I always call him the fastest man alive, and that's not just because he likes to run marathons, but because he literally talks so fast and his brain is operating at this incredible speed. So he's a very unique person in that front. And what's sort of interesting for me is that he's not the most patient person in the world. And I think actually dealing on a day-to-day basis with patients a typical setup in his office was a little bit taxing for him in some ways. But the actual effect that he's had now is it's scaled. So instead of seeing, I think the average doctor sees probably something like a few thousand patients a year. So if you add that up over their whole lifetime, they may see, a few 100,000 people. David has literally helped millions and millions and millions of people around the world. And at the heart of all of this, even underneath all of this incredible financial journey that he's been on and his colleagues have been on, is this unrelenting desire to improve patients' vision and to really help people. And that's the thing that's come through to me most in this book, is that the financial story is fascinating and really intriguing, and there's all kinds of things to learn about risk and value creation and stuff. But the thing that underlies it all is their desire to actually help people. And that comes through loud and clear with all the people that I've talked to in the book. That's what drives them.
And it's one of the key pivot points, isn't it, in eye treatment, that prior to this, there was not very much in the way of pharmaceuticals. It was lasers and operations and surgery and so forth. But he was really driving the push now to use pharmaceuticals for treating eye conditions.
That's right. There were pharmaceuticals for things sort of at the front of the eye. So when you got red eyes and stuff like that, you could put drops and they would be eased. But the really crucial stuff for this book is the stuff at the back of the eye. And for people who are not that familiar with it, that's where the light impulses hit the flesh at the back of your eye, which is the retina, and they turn through chemical transformation to the electrical impulses that go to your brain. So it's a very, very, very crucial part of the visual system. And the things that they were concerned about were affecting the very heart of that. So the diseases that were mostly focused on is age-related macular degeneration, and that literally wipes out your central vision first. So you have this sort of halo of things, but you lose your ability to read, recognize faces. You can't drive. It's hard to do stuff that's right in front of you, like chop vegetables up. All of those kinds of things become increasingly difficult. And that's really the challenge for them, was to come up with something that would treat that. And the prevailing orthodoxy of treatment at the time wasn't really very effective at all. And that's what motivated them.
And it affected millions and millions of people. I mean, people forget now, but there was a large percentage of people who would get to their 50s, 60s and 70s and lose their eyesight, and there was no effective treatment.
Yeah. And actually, the thing that I think we've really done is avoid something even more catastrophic, which is basically our populations now are increasingly getting older. So we're now got lots and lots of people in their 80s and some people in their 90s. And, 30 years ago, that wasn't the case. So if they hadn't come up with this treatment, we would literally be surrounded by all kinds of visually impaired old people. And in essence, that's one of the reasons why it's hard to sort of acknowledge the success of this development, is because we never really saw the truly incredibly bad outcomes that we would be experiencing now with a vastly older population. And that part of the population is significantly larger in terms of percentage of the overall population than it was even 20 or 30 years ago.
And I don't want to use the word hunch, but it was almost like David and his team thought that they were onto something, but going from that hunch into basically building up nearly $1 billion company, there's a lot of work that goes in between.
Yeah, well, a part of the hunch, and I think this is very important for the type of companies that David has formed inside the biotech world, it's often looking at treatments that weren't designed particularly, originally for ophthalmological purposes. And indeed, their original drugs were originally considered to be mostly for oncology, which there was to really stop the growth of tumors, right? And that's why they wanted to sort of control the blood supply to tumors and then stop them from growing. That was the original research. So what it is repurposing something that's been designed for another goal, and then going, oh, wait a minute, this could actually work really well in eyes. And they've done that numerous times. And I think that's one of the important things to think about when you think about the whole pharmaceutical spectrum and the whole biotech world, it's sort of like there's all of these things created in labs, like tens and thousands of molecules, but then only a certain number of them actually make it into the stage where they're getting tested and tried. And then out of those, there's only an even much smaller number that actually sort of get through the rigorous testing system to get through to approval. So all the way along that, you're sort of narrowing down the possibility of success and increasing, there's very, very high levels of risk. So that sort of was interesting for me, was to learn that whole gamut of risk spectrum that this sort of area of biology and pharmaceutical industry is involved with, and it's quite riveting stuff once you get into it.
And one of the barriers that was put up by the pharmaceutical companies to start with was that nobody would want to be able to have an injection in their eye. And they said, but what it turned out is, of course, if people are going to choose between having a needle in your eye or blindness, it's a pretty obvious choice.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big breakthrough for them, in that they essentially came up with a standard way of doing that, because even eye doctors themselves were told that this is very risky and you should avoid doing it. So it wasn't solely just patients not wanting to be injected in their eyes, which of course, when you actually talk to people about it, they're like, yeah, I kind of want to have my eye injected. But, instead of going blind, yes, you'll pretty much do anything. And what was very interesting was there was an Australian researcher who was involved. His name is Andrew Cuthberts, and I spoke to him. He was involved in some of this research that was going on in the early 90s, and that was sort of the height of the AIDS epidemic. And he lived in San Francisco, right near really the epicenter of the epidemic. And he knew that AIDS patients that were getting a particular type of disease that affects their eye were actually getting these eye injections and were, getting that rather than going blind. So even early on, there was a perception amongst this sort of inner circle of people that, it's not so bad. But the general perception of getting an injection in the eye was horrifying, particularly for the marketing people at the drug companies. They just couldn't envisage, if you want to excuse the pun, people actually sort of like lining up to get this done. That was the last thing that they thought would happen.
Yeah, about that pun, and using words like envisage and looking at, it's amazing. I guess you found this when you were writing it, and even having this discussion now, how many aphorisms we have that are based on eyesight and seeing and looking.
Yes, I mean, it's we live in a visual world, let's put it that way. And that's one of the crucial things about the book, was it was actually difficult to find people who had that experience of going blind through AMD, because they're, the people that were really suffering are now dead. And that's why in the book I end up using someone who was one of David's patients, was the editor of Time magazine. And we looked at his story, because he actually wrote a book called Twilight. Mr. Henry Grunwald is his name. And the story that he tells in losing his sight is just mind-blowing when you read it these days. And I think that's one of the challenges for us, certainly from a research point of view, was actually talking to patients who were still alive that could remember just the challenges that they had and faced when doctors basically said to them, there's nothing I can do for you.
It's incredible how many pieces of a puzzle that need to be put together to get a new drug to market. And, the focus and motivation that David must have had to maintain, to not only develop a new drug, but to go through the process of raising large amounts of capital to fund trials, to weather those trials, and also to negotiate with Big Pharma for things like non-US territory deals. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Now, David's company, all of the three that he's formed that we talk about in the book, really don't develop the molecules themselves. So their basic business model is surveying the landscape to see what potential molecules that are already out there. Some of them may have had failings at various trials and things like that for a particular application, but they're looking at sort of an alternative universe and going, well, what if we use that molecule for something else? So there is a whole world out there where there is investment to develop drugs. A lot of it, of course, is conducted through research at universities and places like that. The area in biotech that he's in is sort of really that next stage, which is, okay, so this is possibly a viable substance. How do we actually analyze its potential? And how do we then take that through to development? So there's really a couple of different points that they go through. One is just testing it for safety and all that kind of stuff, and its effectiveness, and that's where the clinical trials come in. Another aspect is how easy is it to manufacture, and how can you scale up, and can you get this molecule, out into the marketplace at a very, very significant scale? And that's another very, very risky and interesting area in drug development. And David's companies had to face all of those kinds of challenges, even if they didn't actually make the molecule themselves. Once they found one, then they have to go through all of these other steps to bring it to market. And every step along the way is, fraught with risk. But that's also the specialty of the people who are investing in that, is to actually analyze that risk and, decide whether or not they're going to take up the challenge and invest in these companies, certainly at the early stage.
And this is why I'm interested to talk about this, because we're talking about a whole sector here, and the lessons we're talking about in the book apply to the whole pharmaceutical space as well. And it's most new pharmaceuticals, or a new company, when they're testing something, it's going to take 8 to 12 years to develop, go through the trials, and phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. But Eyetech managed to bring Macugen to market in 5 years. I mean, it really speaks to David's passion and drive, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible pace that they managed to maintain. They did realize that they were sort of in a race at a certain point, and they definitely did everything they possibly could to speed things up. The key thing for David and his group was they were really the pioneers in that ophthalmological space for setting up the trials. And the very first one that they did was sort of all kind of almost by accident in a way. They set up a trial for a drug called interferon, which in the sort of, I guess, early to mid-90s, some doctors had been using it off-label, which means that they were using a drug that wasn't designed for ophthalmological purposes, but they were using it for that. And they were experiencing some success and seeing patients responding. So David and his group thought, well, if this is happening and they're already starting to tell people this drug works, it really needs to be tested properly. So they actually went about that, and they approached Roche, who was the manufacturer of interferon. And then they set up a global trial for it with Roche. And that was really actually, if you want to look at it from a sort of intellectual property point of view, that's actually the golden intellectual property that David developed, was this ability to do a global test for a drug at the back of the eye, for a retinal disease drug. No one had done that before. And it was an immense effort to get hundreds of eye doctors all around the world to get them to test this drug and to have that measured in all kinds of ways. And so setting that up was really the foundation of his later successes. Now, it's sort of ironic, of course, that drug didn't work, and that they built their successes on an original failure, if you want to look at it that way. But the success was, setting up the system for testing a whole new way of testing drugs for an area that really just didn't exist before.
Okay, well, we'll get to the failure side of things, because they got out of it pretty well, I think, at the time. It was very, very lucky. Talk to us about the funding, because, of course, we needed tens of millions of dollars for this to happen. Tell us about the role of capital raising and Samir Patel's particularly pivotal role in this.
Yeah, well, Samir's story is very interesting from many, many points of view. I mean, his family were Indian family living in East Africa, and basically got chased out by Idi Amin. I don't know if people are familiar with that now. It's quite a while ago. But they had to suddenly leave. They went back to India for a moment and then wound up in the UK, and then eventually ended up in the US. And the last name Patel is quite significant for a large number of Indians in America, and they've been quite successful. The Patel, I guess you'd call it, I'm trying to think of the word right now. It's not exactly an ethnic group, but it's trying to think of the word for that. But anyway, they have set up a number of businesses here. So he was actually able to tap into this group and raise the initial round of money. Now, when they first found this molecule that became Macugen, the company that manufactured it wanted basically, $8 million, and they needed it now. So it was really Samir's network, our family and friends, that managed to pull together that money very quickly. I think it was in a matter of 10 days or 12 days, something around that time, and front that up. So, but that was key to acquiring that molecule. Then once they've done that, the thing is, investors in those kinds of propositions at the early stage of biotech, they're very aware of the high level of risk. So they have to be investors that are very willing to take on high level of risk. So after they got their initial funding, then they started to approach venture capitalists who were in that space. And that's when they started to secure the next rounds of funding. And usually these types of drugs go through at least 2 to 3 series of venture capital. They call them Series A, Series B, Series C. They usually go through multiple phases. And at each of those phases, what they're really looking at is, has the drug been successful at this level of experimentation? Are these trials working? And when they can see that and they see some validation that their results are good, that's when they can up their level of investment. And most of them play a game where they're betting on multiple possibilities at the same time, because the actual chance of success for any one particular molecule to become an approved drug is very low. Even once you get into the first trial phase, out of the drugs that make it into that trial phase, they usually have a less than, around about 1 in 10 chance of actually being approved. So it's a very, very high risk thing. But the rewards, on the other hand, can be quite high as well. So that's where that area of funding exists. And then as you go through that, what often happens, and this happened to David's companies, is once you get through the second phase of the trial and you get good results, that's when you go towards an IPO and to really get the money for the big trials, because the number of people, number of patients involved in a trial is small at the beginning. It's usually just a couple of dozen people at the very, very beginning. And then phase 1, it's sort of around that scale. Phase 2, it's usually a few hundred people. And then once you get to phase 3, it's thousands of people. And obviously there's commensurate costs and risks involved as you scale up.
ShareSite is the portfolio tracking and reporting tool that takes the hassle out of managing your investments. Track your investments like a pro. ShareSite is Investopedia's #1 portfolio tracker for DIY investors, simplifying your finances. So throw that spreadsheet away and get started now. Get 4 months free on an annual premium plan at sharesite.com/shares for beginners. sharesite.com/shares for beginners. So tell us about the IPO. This must have been a very exciting day, going to ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, but more importantly, to have such a robust open.
Yes, the IPOs are very critical. Largely, as I've mentioned before, there's an enormous need for capital once you go into the phase 3 of the trial, and you need to have thousands of patients, multiple sites, often in the hundreds of sites around the planet, where doctors are going to be informed and told how to run the tests and all that kind of stuff. And then you have to have the capital to do that, plus the capital to keep the supply of that drug going throughout the test. And, now you've scaled up. So, yes, the need is great, and that's why the IPOs come in usually after the second trial is completed and there's good positive results from the second trial. That's what gives you the momentum to then go and conduct an IPO. And that's exactly what David was able to do with Macugen. And they were doing this sort of not that long after the dot-com crash, right? So they initially had funding problems, sort of just, it was just not a good environment in the early 2000s, particularly with their company.
People were understandably squeamish.
Yeah, especially seeing as their company had the word tech in it, Eyetech. It might not have been a good idea to use that term tech. If they'd started their company 2 or 3 years later, they probably wouldn't have. But in 2000, it was great. We're going to be Eyetech. So the challenge for them at that point was that the markets had been quite slow, and people were very, very skeptical. But on the other hand, I think there was also a build-up as well. Like, people hadn't been actively involved in the stock market during the downturn following the dot-com crash, and there was probably more of an appetite just around the time that they decided to go for their IPO. And so they sort of had that first mover advantage, especially seeing as by this stage, the need for the drug, dealing with an illness that had millions of sufferers around the planet that had no effective treatment at this point. So the understanding that this was going to be a market-changing drug was something that they could capitalize on, and they did very, very effectively. So their IPO was a huge, huge success and really did fund everything for, set them up for their phase 3 trial. And then, of course, once you do that, that's when you get your approval and you become a drug that actually hits the market.
And yet it's still a coin toss, even at the phase 3 level. It's a 50-50 chance that any molecule is going to make it through that last trial. Yes.
It's a big level of risk. I mean, 50-50 is a big chance. But, the way people interpret that, of course, is, well, it's been successful so far, let's hope this continues. So, but the reality is, yes, you have pretty much a 50% chance of failure. Fortunately for Macugen, that wasn't the case. It was a successful drug and got through its trials and went to market and was the first treatment for age-related macular degeneration to reach the market. And, that was pretty successful for them. As we went on in the book, and I think you may have just read this part actually about their next drug, not such a good story on the third trial. So,
we'll get to that. Yes, I know. But it's at this stage just talking about Macugen still. And this is something that's experienced by any biotech investor. The volatility, the share price can go up and down by incredible amounts, and often it's to do with some sort of FDA announcement. And I remember the scene when they were in the lift and David was talking to someone who said, our share price has just gone up 20%. And it was on the back of an FDA meeting of some sort. But yeah, that's just something to think about, isn't it, for any kind of biotech investing?
Yeah, the machinations of the FDA are very, very crucial. And they were fortunate in a number of ways in that the FDA also looks at drugs that are treating diseases that are what they call novel. So if there isn't an existing treatment, then you can fast track your FDA processes. And that was possible with Macugen, that because it was treating a new condition, they were able to speed up some of the bureaucratic side of the FDA approval process. But yes, it's very, very, very carefully passed information. Whenever they say something, it's sort of a bit like, when the Fed gets together and has a meeting and talk, people are always trying to read between the lines about, is it going to be a rate increase or not? It's that level of importance that the FDA has.
So I remember reading earlier on in the book is that moving into a CEO role, that there are so many skills that need to be picked up and developed, and one of them is developing an exit strategy. Tell us about the Eyetech exit strategy.
Yeah, their exit strategy, I don't think was fully formed when they first went into this because, as we mentioned, they weren't very experienced businessmen, but they certainly have developed exit strategies along the way. For them, one of the challenges as a small company, of course, is scaling up. And once you start to have a product that is going to be available globally, you really do need the help of a big pharma company to get it out there. And that's why they ended up partnering with Pfizer. So partnering with Pfizer really helped them bring it to market globally. And it also gave them a lot of validity in some ways of being a company that was taken very, very seriously once they started partnering with Pfizer. I mean, they were being taken seriously before that, and they had a number of offers, but they ended up going with Pfizer. But that wasn't the sale of the company. Eventually, Pfizer did a deal with them to basically do the non-US side of the business, manufacturing and distributing, globally outside of the US. Then they ended up being acquired by another company, OSI, for what at the time was a very considerable amount of money, which was $935 million was the actual cost of the acquisition. And so that was their exit at that point. And I think they were extraordinarily happy with that exit strategy.
And then almost immediately after, Macugen was superseded by another pharmaceutical which did a much better job, and Eyetech and their IP and everything was worth next to nothing.
Yes, they went from the great high of $935 million valuation to $25 million in pretty much almost overnight, largely because of the advent of Lucentis, which was, by all accounts, just a much better drug. Ironically, as we know, when you read the book, their very first encounter is with the company, Genentech, who brought out Lucentis. And it was really, I think, Genentech sort of looking over their shoulder and seeing, oh, wow, these guys have gotten, this huge thing up and running that incentivized Genentech to actually go out and develop Lucentis. It's a slightly different molecule from the one that that David and his team were originally looking at, but they did first talk to Genentech about that. So it was basically Genentech playing catch up after they saw that they had missed an opportunity when they saw what was happening with Macugen. So that's really what happened. And Lucentis is still a very large part of the market for AMD drugs, and this is now 20 years later.
So the next chapter was Ophtotech, and by this stage, David had moved into the venture capital space as well. Tell us about the how that played out from there on in.
Yeah, David discovered that he really enjoyed business, not surprisingly, after his experience with Macugen, I guess, and the company.
Some would be tempted. Some would be tempted just to keep the money and buy a yacht and sail off into the sunset.
Yeah, not David. I don't really see David having the patience to do that. And he also, of course, is very motivated by improving people's sight. So, he's always kind of looking for the next thing to do that will improve patient outcomes. So, the story with Ophtotech was basically, well, we know that then there's still other possibilities at the back of the eye, and there's still ways to keep improving upon what they've already achieved. So that was sort of the founding, and that's the same with a lot of other pharmaceuticals. Like when you get some kind of treatment, it does A, B, and C, and then you'll find another drug that does D, E, and F, and eventually you might need multiple drugs to cover everything from A to Z, as we say in Australia, or A to Z, as we say over here. Right? So that's sort of where they went next. Was like, well, how can we keep working in this area and continue to make improvements? And this is when David was sitting in the venture capital seat and decided to help fund a company that his friend Samir would actually run, and that was Ophtotech. Again, they did keep tech in the name. I think they felt that they were enough past the .com era to have tech, especially seeing as they had so much success with Eyetech. But they did their usual mode, which is to go out and try and find a molecule that they thought had potential, and then they did a lot of shopping around. I mean, they looked at hundreds and hundreds of potential molecules before sort of zeroing in on two that they thought were very, very likely to be successful and solve some unmet needs inside the retinal disease area. So that was sort of the genesis of Ophtotech.
And one of the first experiences was with a molecule called Fovista, which made it very well through the first two phases of the trials.
Indeed. Fovista is sort of a lesson in probability and chance. It sort of did so well at the beginning in its first two trials that everybody was just sure it was going to succeed. They felt extraordinarily confident about it. However, as we learn, it's not always what it seems on the surface anyway.
I mean, it must be pretty amazing to get to that stage where you're so excited and it seems to work at early stages in the trial. And they're sitting there at that meeting and they're waiting for that PowerPoint to come up to show what the effectiveness is at the phase 3 level, and it failed. Imagine what the investors must be feeling.
Yeah, the investors were not happy, that much I can tell you. And there were certain investors who were more than unhappy. And yes, it spiraled off into a very, very, very nasty situation once Fovista failed, because the expectations, having gone through an IPO and done all that sort of stuff, and actually had a very, very successful IPO, yes, they were not ready for this outcome.
To the extent of hiring bodyguards.
Yes, there were some unfortunate phone calls that led them to suspect that there were actual dangers, they're under physical danger. One of those things where the danger's real, and they may have been. I mean, this is America we're talking about, and there's lots of crazy people out there with guns. So, you do need to take these things seriously. And then the other thing is, are you just being overly paranoid about this? But, they had to take precautions. They were that scared that something may step off with the level of disappointment that their share price after it crashed had caused in the marketplace.
So, Ian, tell us about Iveric, and which was the next venture for David.
Yeah, so Iveric, essentially Ophtotech had such a bad reputation after the failure of Fovista in its third phase trial that it was decided to rebrand Ophtotech. So Iveric is still the same company as Ophtotech, but they changed the name. And they also changed focus. So they brought in a new CEO. Samir stepped aside, and this guy, Glenn Splendorio, came in, who had been working with them before. But anyway, he came in and took over as CEO and wanted to rebrand it and also to focus more on the genetic side of drug development. And they went down that path for a while. David wasn't entirely convinced that this was the right mode. And they also, as I mentioned before, they had found two molecules in their initial study, and he decided we should be taking the second, or they should be taking the second molecule more seriously. And there was a lot of internal debate around that, and eventually they did start taking that molecule seriously, and it turned out to be a champion as well. And even though they had this failure of the Fovista phase 3 trial, their next molecule was far more successful. And actually, when they wound up that company, they sold it for, I think, close to $6 billion. So they more than made up. But it was really the second horse in that they were betting on that was actually the winner. And that was the key to their success, was to make sure they had more than a one-trick pony, and they had something up their sleeve.
Yes, that's part of playing the odds, I guess, in the biotech space, isn't it?
Yes.
So the world of big pharma gets a lot of bad press. How do you feel about, looking through this, the biotech industry, the big pharma industry, and how they work together? What are your thoughts and feelings overall about it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've certainly never been a huge fan of the big pharma world from what I've read in the newspapers, and also I have a lot of friends that are very skeptical about the industry. This has given me a whole new level of appreciation in terms of the risk that's involved, the expenses that are involved, and particularly with David's group of people, the dedication that they have and their commitment to actually making people's lives better. Even though the money is, that you read about is just extraordinary in some ways, then I wouldn't say, no one's interested in money. That's not true, but their overall motivation is clearly to help people. That's really the thing that's been motivating them all the way along. And the satisfaction that they get knowing that they have done that is tremendous. And that's kind of what keeps David going. It's not so much, I need to start another company and make X billion dollars. It's really, how can I help people? And I think that's something that has been very reassuring, to know that actually trying to improve people's lives is really the foundation. And it's not just purely, the pursuit of dollars. I mean, the American system is very difficult. The healthcare system over here, I don't think there's anybody in the country that would say, gee, we have a great healthcare system, So, it sits, in that backdrop. But understanding the processes that go into drug development has given me, a slightly more broader perspective on, the risks involved and the rewards that are attained as well. So I hope that helps.
Oh, let's hope so. I think this is a great lesson for people who might be hearing stories of biotech companies that are promoting some great advance in a drug that their development, that it's a very long process. There's a lot of hurdles. There's a lot of approvals that need to be gone through and a lot of capital that's involved. So it's worthwhile being skeptical if you hear any stories like that.
Indeed. And what they're also investigating while they're going through these trial phases is also looking for possible side effects and other indications that the drug is not safe. And, even if a drug is super, super effective and cures whatever it's supposed to do, if the side effects are also significant, well, then it's not really going to make it to market either. So there's levels of risk all across the whole process. And you really need to be analyzing all of that kind of risk if you're going to be making an investment in something.
And we can't finish off this interview without talking about David's obsession with food. When he's been running around the United States on private airplanes, food has played a huge role, hasn't it?
Indeed. I have to say, first of all, that David doesn't fly private jets generally. That was only really...
That was just at that stage when you're just getting the investment and there's no other way of doing 3 meetings in a day, for example.
Yeah,
pre-Zoom days, yes.
Yeah, he's a commercial plane user generally. But yes, when they needed to be in like 4 different cities in the same day and have 3 or 4 investor meetings in each of those cities, that's when they were using their private jets. But yes, David is a complete obsessed foodie, and he's the type of guy who, he likes eating in fine dining establishments. That's all well and good, but he really likes hunting down that novel, special little food stand that's in the middle of nowhere that's got particularly the spiciest food that he can find. He's a real spice demon on that level. So his fascination for food plays out in a number of quite interesting ways. One is that when he does find gold, he really digs in, and if he finds a restaurant that he loves in a city, he will literally go to that restaurant every meal that he can. So if it's open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he will go there 3 times a day. If it's only open for lunch and dinner, it'll be twice. So he when he finds what he likes, he just sticks with it. But his level of investigation and trying to find the latest and best thrill, particularly if it's spicy, that's quite something. And in the book, we do put down a list at the end of his 40 favorite restaurants around the world, which does include one in Australia.
Oh, which one was that?
He liked Rockpool. He liked Rockpool. In Melbourne. It was that was his favourite there, but he doesn't list any.
Not Sydney Rockpool.
I don't know why he didn't make it to the Sydney one, but the Melbourne one is one that stayed in his mind. But yeah, he's a total foodie, completely obsessed. And I think when they were flying around in the jets, what was really exciting for them was, one, the ability to go to all these different places in the same day, and two, that the airline people, not airline people, but the jet people, were willing to go and source stuff. So if they knew that a good restaurant existed in some city, they would call it up and get the food delivered to the plane. And that just really made it for them. It's like, not only do you get to fly around in this sort of incredible environment, but you get all the best food in the world while you're doing it. So yes, that was definitely a highlight for them.
Okay, Ian, so remind us of the name of the book, and you don't need to tell us where we can get it from. I'll put all those in the links in the notes in the description.
Right. Well, it's Unblinded, and it's the startup that launched a revolution in saving sight.
Ian Keldoulis, or should I say Bill Maher's long-lost Australian brother, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm sure you've had that one before.
I got chased around an airport by a TSA agent that thought I was Bill Maher, and yes, he was completely obsessed. It does happen quite frequently, so...
Yeah, what happens with that? I mean, don't they hear the accent and realise, Bill Maher doesn't have an Aussie accent?
No, I don't know. He asked me if I had a TV show, and I said, "Well, I'm working on one." But anyway, yeah, it does happen. My partner, she always wants me to put my hair down like this so people don't think I look like Bill Maher, but I don't think it has any effect. So it happens all the time.
Ian Keldoulis, thank you so much for joining me for this interview.
And it's wonderful to chat with you again, Phil. We haven't chatted for quite a while, but it's a pleasure catching up.